All right. Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah, excited for this one.
Yeah, this time we're going way back, right? Ancient Greece,
Yeah.
Aristotle.
Yep.
So, we asked all of you out there, what sources should we look at? What should we dive into? And we got a lot of really interesting responses. But one of the most requested was to kind of go back to the original, the OG of Western philosophy, and thinking about ethics, Aristotle.
Yeah.
And specifically, what are his core ideas about ethics, uh, about happiness, about virtue, and how we should all live good lives. Now, we should probably clarify up front that, when we're talking about Aristotle's ethics, it's not like, he wrote a book, sat down and wrote a book called Ethics, slapped the title on there and said, here's my book, Ethics.
Yeah. Right.
He didn't do that, right?
No, not really. It's, well, first of all, we should remember it's ethics with an S. Plural, because it wasn't even really a unified book in the way we think of it. More like a collection of connected questions, all exploring this idea of character and how people should live well, individually and together, right, in a state.
Yeah.
In fact, that's where the famous politics comes in. Not really a separate work, but part of this larger inquiry.
So individual and community kind of woven together already.
Exactly.
Interesting.
But before we even get to his arguments, it's really crucial to get this underlying assumption, the Greek perspective. Yeah. For them, life wasn't just a random series of events, right? It had a direction, a goal, an aim, an ultimate good, like you said, this ideal element. Mm. And this good, this end, it wasn't just some vague notion. They believed it was something definable, knowable, even before you fully achieved it.
Which has huge implications for us today.
Right.
Because if you believe this, knowing this ultimate aim is like the key to everything. It's not just some theoretical academic exercise. It becomes absolutely essential, right, for your own personal choices, for living a life with purpose, but also for organizing society, for good governance, for actually running a state well. This really highlights how central knowledge was for them. Knowing what's truly best, that's at the core of living a good life.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that Aristotle doesn't frame this ultimate end as like a duty imposed from above, right? It's not a list of rules or commandments. He links it to something very human.
Yeah.
Something we all crave, desire, right?
Mm.
But not just any desire, not fleeting whims. He's talking about something deeper, the desire for happiness, for well-being, for a state of flourishing.
Yeah. When you put it like that, it almost sounds obvious, doesn't it?
I mean,
he doesn't want to be happy.
Right, and that's exactly his point. This isn't some arbitrary moral code. It's rooted in what we all naturally seek.
Okay, so happiness. But before we get too excited, Aristotle wants to be very clear about what happiness isn't, right?
Yeah, he kind of clears the ground, gets rid of some common misconceptions, like equating happiness with just feeling pleasure all the time, or with having lots of wealth or power. He's hinting that his view is going to be a bit more, sophisticated.
Right. So then what is it? What's his actual positive view of happiness?
Well, this is where his concept of activity or energia comes in. Now, it's not about just being busy, right? He's talking about a specific kind of activity, one that's fulfilling, one that contributes to your overall flourishing. But there's a catch, right? It has to be uniquely human. He's linking happiness to our capacity for reason.
Okay, so this is where his idea of virtues comes in, right? Those qualities that allow us to excel as human beings.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And he divides these into two main categories: intellectual virtues and moral virtues. Intellectual virtues, like wisdom and understanding, they're generally developed through learning, through education. But the moral virtues, these are things like courage, fairness, generosity, what he calls goodness of character. These are cultivated through practice, discipline, habit. It's not enough to just know what's right. You have to become a good person by consistently doing good things.
So you're saying even if you're a brilliant philosopher, if you don't act on that knowledge, you won't be truly happy.
That's essentially it. You need both. And for most of us, developing these moral virtues, that's the real key to living a good life. It's the bedrock.
Okay, so how do we develop these virtues? I mean, it sounds kind of vague.
Well, he introduces this really insightful idea of the mean state. This is central to his ethical framework. He suggests that a virtue is essentially the midpoint between two extremes. So think of courage. On one hand, you have excessive fear, which would be cowardice. And on the other, you have a complete lack of fear, which might lead to rashness, recklessness. True courage lies somewhere in the middle, the appropriate amount of fear for a given situation.
So it's not about suppressing our emotions entirely.
No, it's about having the right emotional response, the right amount, in the right context. And he applies this to all sorts of virtues. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wastefulness. Temperance is the mean between insensitivity to pleasure and overindulgence.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot.
Exactly. But it's important to remember these aren't rigid rules like always do this, never do that. Aristotle understood that life is messy, right?
Yeah.
And that the exact right action will depend on the specific situation and the individual involved. There's always room for judgment and nuance.
Okay, so we've got virtues, we've got this idea of the mean. But before we go any further, I think we need to address a really fundamental question. And that's the question of responsibility. I mean, are we really responsible for all of our actions? What about, like, if we're forced to do something? Or if we didn't know any better?
That's a really important point. And
Yeah.
Aristotle does address it directly. He draws a clear distinction between involuntary actions and voluntary actions.
Okay, so what are involuntary actions?
Involuntary actions are those that are done under coercion, right? You're forced to do something. Or they're done out of ignorance, meaning you genuinely didn't know what you were doing or the consequences of your actions. In those cases, Aristotle argues, you're not really responsible in the same way. So, like, if someone's holding a gun to your head and makes you do something illegal, that wouldn't be considered a voluntary action, and you wouldn't be held morally accountable in the same way.
Right, that makes sense. So the voluntary actions are,
Voluntary actions are the opposite. They originate within you. You choose to do them. You're aware of the circumstances, and you consent to the act. He's very clear that just feeling a strong emotion or not knowing the exact moral rule doesn't get you off the hook. You're still responsible.
so like if I yell at someone because I'm angry, I can't just say, oh, sorry, I was just really angry.
Right. You're still responsible for your actions, even if they're influenced by emotions. But he does make a further distinction between acting voluntarily and acting with a specific intention. You might do something voluntarily, meaning you chose to do it, but your ultimate goal, your reason for doing it, might be different. This nuance becomes important when we're evaluating someone's character and their moral choices.
Okay, so we've talked about virtue, we've talked about responsibility. This all kind of leads into something that I think is really interesting and actually quite practical for all of us. And that's his idea of practical wisdom.
Ah, yes, phronesis. This is a really key concept for Aristotle. And it's not just for philosophers or leaders. It's essential for anyone who wants to live well. Basically, practical wisdom is this ability to discern the right course of action in any given situation. It involves understanding the general principles of what is good, but also being able to apply those principles to the messy reality of everyday life.
It almost sounds like common sense, but I get the feeling it's a bit more than that.
It is, because true practical wisdom, according to Aristotle, is deeply intertwined with virtue. He argues that you can't really have one without the other. A person with a bad character, he says, is actually blinded to what is truly good. They might be clever, cunning, even successful in a worldly sense, but they lack that deeper understanding of what will lead to genuine happiness.
So you can be smart, but not wise.
Exactly. Practical wisdom is more than just intelligence. It's about having a well-formed character, a virtuous disposition that allows you to see clearly what is truly good and then act on that knowledge. It's the integration of intellect and character. And while Aristotle doesn't believe that we just intuitively know what's right in every situation, he's not an intuitionist. He does recognize that in truly virtuous conduct, there's a kind of direct apprehension, a seeing of both the end and the means.
Interesting. Now, we've been talking a lot about knowing what's right and acting virtuously. But what about those times when we, well, fail to live up to our own ideals? You know, we know what we should do, but we end up doing something else. Aristotle calls this incontinence, what we might call weakness of will.
Yeah, that's a classic human struggle. And even Socrates, famously denied that it was even possible. He believed that if you truly knew the good, you would automatically do it.
But Aristotle was a bit more realistic, I guess.
He was. He acknowledged that we do sometimes act against our better judgment. And his explanation is that while we might have the knowledge of what's right, our passions, our desires, can be so strong in the moment that they overpower reason. It's like our rational mind knows one thing, but our impulsive side takes over.
It's like knowing you should go to the gym, but ending up on the couch with a bag of chips instead.
Exactly. It happens to the best of us. But the important thing for Aristotle is to recognize this tendency in ourselves and to work on strengthening our self-control, our ability to act in accordance with our reasoned judgment, even when it's difficult.
Okay, so we've talked about individual virtue, happiness, practical wisdom, and those pesky times when we, well, mess up. But all of this individual stuff kind of begs the question,
Yeah.
what about the bigger picture? What about society? What about the state?
Right, that's where things get even more interesting, because Aristotle doesn't see ethics as just a private individual affair. It's deeply connected to the well-being of the community, the polis. And in fact, his ultimate aim, he says, is to determine the best form of government, its constitution, its laws, everything that makes a society function well.
So he's not just interested in, like, personal happiness.
Right.
He wants to understand how to create a good society.
Exactly. He sees it all as connected. He believes that a just and well-ordered state is essential for individuals to truly flourish, to achieve that ultimate happiness we've been talking about.
So in a way, his ethical framework is also a political framework.
You could say that. He's laying out not just a guide for individual conduct, but also principles for creating a just and flourishing society.
So it's not just about me being happy, it's about everyone having the opportunity to be happy.
Right. He sees individual happiness as being intertwined with the well-being of the community as a whole.
That's a pretty radical idea even today. Now I want to touch on something that's often associated with happiness, and that's pleasure. Where does pleasure fit into Aristotle's ethical scheme?
That's a great question, and it's one that he grapples with directly. He argues that for a virtuous person, acting virtuously is actually inherently pleasurable. It's not something they have to force themselves to do. They actually find joy and satisfaction in doing good things.
So it's not like you're denying yourself pleasure to be good.
No, it's more like the pleasure comes from being virtuous. It's part of the experience. But he does acknowledge that certain external things, like having friends, having enough money, having some degree of influence, these can be helpful, even necessary, for living a virtuous life. He calls these things appliances. It's like you can't really be generous if you have nothing to give.
Right, you need some resources to actually put those virtues into practice.
Exactly. He also addresses why we might not consider, like, young children or people who have suffered extreme misfortune to be fully happy.
Because they haven't had the chance to develop their virtues.
Partly, yes. He suggests that happiness requires not only complete virtue, but also a complete life, meaning enough time for that virtue to really manifest itself. Children haven't had that time yet, and people who have suffered great losses might have had their opportunities for flourishing severely limited. But he also acknowledges that even in the face of terrible misfortune, a virtuous person can still respond in a noble way.
So it's not just about what happens to you, but how you react to it.
Exactly. He emphasizes that the nobility of character can shine through even in the darkest of times.
He also has this interesting discussion about whether happiness is something that's praised or something that's precious.
He explains that we typically praise things for their qualities or their usefulness in achieving something else. So we might praise someone for their courage because it allows them to do brave things. But happiness, he argues, is different. It's not praise because it's not a means to something else. It's the end in itself. It's the ultimate good that everything else is directed towards. He even mentions another philosopher, Eudoxus, who argued that pleasure is the highest good precisely because it's not praised, but is the standard by which we judge all other goods. It's like the ultimate reference point.
Okay, so circling back to this idea of the soul having rational and irrational parts, how does that play into his ethics?
He argues that even our irrational parts, like our desires and appetites, can be influenced by reason. They can learn to obey reason, much like a child learns to obey their parents. And he links this to his distinction between intellectual and moral virtues. Intellectual virtues are about the excellence of our rational mind, while moral virtues involve our irrational parts being properly guided by reason. It's about that harmony between reason and emotion.
Okay, but how do we actually develop these moral virtues? Is it something we're just born with?
No, definitely not. Aristotle was very clear that moral virtue is something we acquire through habituation, through repeatedly performing virtuous actions. He compares it to learning a craft. You become a builder by building, a musician by playing. You become virtuous by doing virtuous things. It's about practice, about forming the right habits. He even says, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit.
So it's about actually doing good, not just knowing what good is.
Precisely. He stresses that knowledge alone isn't enough. It's the consistent practice, the repeated action that shapes our character and makes us virtuous. He also emphasizes that both excess and deficiency can be harmful to virtue. So finding that mean state, that balanced middle ground, is key. He uses the analogy of physical health. Just like you need a balanced diet and regular exercise to be physically healthy, you need a balanced approach to your actions and emotions to develop a virtuous character.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot, that golden mean.
Exactly. And figuring out where that mean lies in any given situation. That takes judgment, that takes experience, that takes what he calls moral vision. He even advises that as a practical strategy, it might be helpful to intentionally aim slightly towards either the excess or the deficiency as a way of eventually landing closer to the true mean. Like if you tend to be too timid, try being a bit bolder. If you're prone to overindulgence, try practicing a bit more restraint.
So it's about kind of calibrating your moral compass through experience.
You could put it that way. And as we've mentioned, he gives lots of specific examples of virtues and how they operate in different areas of life. He discusses courage, generosity, temperance, justice, truthfulness, wit, and many others. And he explores how each of these virtues involves finding that balance between extremes.
I think it would be helpful to unpack a few of these specific virtues in more detail, just to give our listeners a clearer sense of how his framework works.
Absolutely. So let's take meekness, for example. He describes meekness as the mean in relation to anger. It's about having the appropriate amount of anger directed at the right things for the right reasons. He points out that even the extremes around anger, too much anger or too little anger, don't have clear-cut names in our language, which highlights how nuanced these moral states can be. Someone who is meek, he says, gets angry at the right things, with the right people, in the right way, at the right time, and for the right amount of time. It's about having a balanced and controlled response to situations that might provoke anger.
He also talks about virtues related to social interaction, like being agreeable or
Yeah,
pleasant.
he does. He suggests that in our interactions with others, we should strive to be appropriate, to avoid causing unnecessary pain or offense, and to generally contribute to a positive and enjoyable experience. But he also emphasizes that this should always be guided by what is noble and beneficial, not just by a desire to please or avoid conflict.
What about virtues like truthfulness?
Truthfulness, for Aristotle, is about honesty and sincerity. He sees it as the mean between boastfulness, which is overstating your accomplishments or abilities, and irony or mock modesty, which is downplaying your achievements. The truthful person, he says, speaks straightforwardly and accurately about their capabilities and experiences.
And even our sense of humor can be a virtue.
He actually discusses wit and humor in the context of virtue. He describes tact as the mean in relation to amusement and joking. The tactful person knows what kinds of jokes and humor are appropriate for a well-bred and cultivated individual. They avoid crude or offensive humor and strive to engage in witty and intelligent banter that is both enjoyable and intellectually stimulating.
And what about shame? We often think of shame as a negative emotion, but does Aristotle consider it a virtue?
He actually doesn't consider shame to be a virtue in itself. He views it more as a feeling associated with having acted wrongly. In his view, a truly virtuous person ideally wouldn't experience shame because they wouldn't intentionally do things that are shameful. He acknowledges that shame can be a useful emotion in the sense that it can motivate us to avoid wrongdoing, but he emphasizes that the virtues themselves are inherently good, not just good because they help us avoid negative consequences like shame.
Now, we can't talk about Aristotle's ethics without discussing one of the most central virtues in his whole system, justice.
Absolutely. Justice is a cornerstone of Aristotle's ethical and political thought. He describes it as a virtue that relates to both lawfulness and equality. He contrasts the just person with the unjust person, who he describes as being driven by greed, always wanting more than their fair share, especially when it comes to things that are subject to good or bad fortune.
He actually distinguishes between different kinds of justice, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about justice in a broader sense as encompassing all of virtue in its relation to the community. So it's about aiming to create and maintain a society where everyone has the opportunity to flourish, to live a good life. And then he distinguishes this from what he calls particular justice, which focuses on specific interactions and transactions between individuals.
So one is about the overall justness of society, and the other is about fairness in our dealings with each other.
Precisely. And he breaks down particular justice even further into two categories: distributive justice and corrective justice.
Okay, what's the difference?
Distributive justice is about fairly allocating resources, honors, and other goods within a society. It's about making sure that everyone receives what they deserve based on some principle of merit. Of course, what constitutes merit, whether it's based on talent, hard work, social status, or something else, is a matter of debate. But the basic principle is fairness in the distribution of benefits and burdens. Corrective justice, on the other hand, comes into play when injustices have already occurred. It's about rectifying those injustices and restoring balance. Think of it like a judge in a courtroom who's trying to ensure that a wrong is made right.
He makes an important point about the difference between acting unjustly and being unjustly treated.
Yes, he's very clear that those are two different things. You can act unjustly towards someone without them necessarily suffering any harm or being treated unfairly in that specific instance. And conversely, you can be the victim of injustice even if the person who wronged you isn't necessarily a habitually unjust person. He also challenges the common assumption that acting justly is easy. While the physical act itself might be straightforward, like repaying a debt, doing it with the right intention, under the right circumstances, and as an expression of a truly just character, that requires a lot more than just following a simple rule.
Okay, we've talked a lot about moral virtues. Now let's circle back to those intellectual virtues. You mentioned earlier that he identifies 5 main ones.
Right, so we have art or craftsmanship, techne, scientific knowledge, episteme, practical wisdom, phronesis, which we've discussed quite a bit already, philosophical wisdom, sophia, and intuitive reason, nous. He excludes things like supposition and opinion because those are fallible and don't necessarily lead to truth.
Let's break those down a bit, starting with art or techne.
Art, in this context, is about having a reasoned capacity to make or produce things. It's about having the skill and knowledge to create something, whether it's a physical object, a piece of music, or a well-crafted argument. Then there's scientific knowledge, or episteme, which is about understanding why things are the way they are. It's about having demonstrable proof, based on first principles, for your claims.
And practical wisdom, as we discussed, is about applying that knowledge to real-life situations, making good judgments about how to act. What about philosophical wisdom, or Sophia?
Philosophical wisdom, or sophia, is considered the highest form of intellectual virtue. It's about understanding the most fundamental and universal truths about reality. It combines scientific knowledge with intuitive reason, which is the ability to grasp those first principles, those foundational truths that underpin all knowledge.
An intuitive reason is like.
Think of it as that spark of insight, that ability to see the truth directly without needing a long chain of reasoning. It's what allows us to grasp those basic axioms upon which all other knowledge is built.
He also talks about a few other intellectual capacities, like good counsel, understanding, and judgment. What are those about?
Good counsel, or Eubulia, is about deliberating well, considering all the relevant factors, and arriving at the best possible course of action. Understanding, or synesis, is simply the ability to judge things rightly. And judgment, or nome, is a specific kind of right judgment, one that's characteristic of an equitable person. It's about being able to apply general principles to specific situations in a fair and nuanced way.
So all of these intellectual capacities are about making good judgments and understanding the world around us.
Exactly. They're all about using our reason well. And he emphasizes that practical wisdom, while essential for action, is also valuable in itself, even if we're not actively engaged in some practical pursuit. It's an excellence of the soul, just like the other intellectual virtues.
Now, this might seem like a silly question, but does being practically wise automatically make you a good person?
That's a question Aristotle addresses directly. And his answer is no. Just because you know what is good doesn't mean you'll actually do what is good. You need to develop your character, to cultivate those moral virtues, to actually become a good person. He introduces this concept of natural virtue, which is like an innate predisposition towards goodness, a natural inclination to do the right thing. But he contrasts this with matured virtue, which requires practical wisdom. It's about taking those natural inclinations and refining them, shaping them through conscious effort and practice.
So it's like having the potential for goodness, but you still need to develop it.
Exactly. True goodness, for Aristotle, involves both. And he argues that all the virtues, when they reach their full maturity, are inseparable from practical wisdom. They all work together in harmony to create a truly virtuous character.
Okay, now I want to touch on something that I think we can all relate to, that struggle between our better judgment and our desires. He talks about self-control, or sophrosine, and lack of self-control, or akrasia.
Yeah, those are two sides of the same coin. He actually distinguishes between several different levels of self-mastery. There's perfect self-mastery, which combines both self-control and endurance, the ability to resist pleasure and withstand pain. Then there's your self-control, which is the ability to resist temptation even when you feel the pull. Then there's imperfect self-control, which is when you give in to your desires even though you know better. And finally, there's lack of self-control, which is when you don't even put up a fight against your base desires. You just succumb to them.
He addresses that classic Socratic paradox here, doesn't he? That question of whether we can truly act against our better judgment.
He does. And while Socrates believed it was impossible, Aristotle offers a more nuanced explanation. He suggests that even if you have the knowledge of what's right, you might not be actively using that knowledge in a moment of temptation. Your desires can cloud your judgment and lead you to act in a way that contradicts your rational understanding. He uses the example of a practical syllogism to illustrate this. You might have this general principle in your mind, like stealing is wrong, but then you see a delicious-looking apple that's unguarded, and your desire for that apple overwhelms your rational judgment, and you end up stealing it.
So it's like your desire kind of short-circuits your reasoning process.
Exactly. And he also distinguishes between a lack of self-control regarding things like food and drink, which are natural desires, and a lack of self-control regarding things like honor and wealth, which aren't inherently bad in themselves, but can become excessive. He suggests that the latter is a more serious moral failing because it involves a perversion of our desires, a seeking after things that are not truly good for us.
He also compares a lack of self-control with anger.
Right. He argues that a lack of self-control driven by pleasure is actually more disgraceful than anger, because anger, in a way, follows a kind of reason. You're angry because you perceive that you've been wronged, but lust, for example, is purely impulsive and doesn't involve any rational consideration.
He also returns to this idea of pleasure later on, addressing the different philosophical views on its role in the good life.
Yes, he outlines several common arguments against pleasure. Some philosophers believe that pleasure is not good at all. Others argue that while some pleasures might be good, others are not. And still, others maintain that pleasure is not the ultimate or chief good. He presents arguments like, pleasure is a process, not an end in itself. The self-controlled person avoids certain pleasures. Intense pleasure can hinder thought. Children and animals pursue pleasure, so it can't be the highest good for humans.
But then he offers his own perspective on pleasure, right?
He does. He argues that pleasure is clearly a good thing because it's the opposite of pain, which is generally considered to be bad. But he distinguishes between genuine pleasures, which are those that are in accordance with our nature and contribute to our flourishing, and those that only seem pleasurable because they alleviate pain or a negative state, like the relief you feel when you scratch an itch. He suggests that true pleasure is found in the unimpeded activity of our natural faculties. So the pleasure of eating comes from satisfying our natural hunger, the pleasure of learning comes from exercising our intellect, and so on.
So it's about finding pleasure in activities that are good for us, that fulfill our nature.
Exactly. And he argues that the pleasures of the intellect are superior to the pleasures of the body because they're more enduring, more stable, and more conducive to our overall well-being.
Now, another essential aspect of a good life for most of us is friendship. Aristotle dedicates a significant portion of his ethics to this topic.
Yes, friendship, or philia, is a very important concept for Aristotle. He defines it as kindliness between persons who reciprocate it, emphasizing that true friendship requires mutual goodwill and awareness. He distinguishes between simply wishing someone well, kindliness, and true friendship, which involves reciprocal affection and some degree of shared life and experience.
He also categorizes friendships based on the underlying motive or basis of the relationship.
Right. He identifies three main types: friendships based on shared virtue, friendships based on mutual pleasure, and friendships based on mutual utility. He argues that the most complete and enduring friendships are those that are grounded in virtue. These are friendships between good people who admire each other's character and genuinely care about each other's well-being. They wish each other well for their own sake, not just for any benefit they might receive. These kinds of friendships require time and intimacy to develop, but they offer the greatest rewards.
What about the other types of friendship?
Friendships based on pleasure or utility are less stable because they tend to dissolve when the pleasure or utility ceases. So if you're friends with someone primarily because you enjoy doing the same activities together, that friendship might fade if you no longer share those interests. But he does point out that even in virtue-based friendships, there can be elements of pleasure and utility. Good people often find each other to be pleasant company and can be helpful to each other in various ways. But the foundation of the relationship is their shared goodness.
He also discusses friendships between people who are unequal in some way.
Yes, like a parent and child or a teacher and student. He suggests that in these relationships, the love and honor given should be proportionate to the difference in their roles. He emphasizes that all genuine friendships involve some degree of shared experience or communion, whether it's shared values, shared activities, or simply enjoying each other's company.
He even talks about why friendships sometimes end or fall apart.
He explains that in friendships based on pleasure or utility, quarrels can arise if one person feels they're not getting what they expected out of the relationship. But in friendships based on virtue, where the motive is genuinely caring for the other person's well-being, disagreements are less likely to lead to a break. He also notes that in unequal friendships, each party might have different expectations and feel entitled to different things, which can sometimes lead to tension.
All of this talk about friendship naturally leads to the question of how we should view ourselves. He addresses the concept of self-love.
He does. And he's careful to distinguish between a blameworthy kind of self-love, which is basically selfishness, and a praiseworthy kind of self-love, which is about desiring what is truly good for yourself and acting in accordance with reason. He argues that a good person, by pursuing virtue and doing good deeds, actually benefits themselves the most. They're living in accordance with their nature and fulfilling their potential. So, true self-love, for Aristotle, isn't about indulging every whim or prioritizing your own needs above everyone else's. It's about living a virtuous life, which ultimately brings the greatest happiness and fulfillment.
He even asks whether a truly happy person needs friends at all.
Some might argue that if you've achieved true happiness and self-sufficiency, you wouldn't need friends. But Aristotle disagrees. He suggests that while a happy person might not need friends in the sense of being dependent on them, having friends actually enhances their happiness. It gives them more opportunities to exercise virtue, to share their joy, and to simply enjoy the company of others who share their values. He even goes so far as to say that a true friend is like a second self, making their friend's existence as desirable as one's own.
He also talks about the ideal number of friends.
He suggests that having too many friends, especially for the sake of utility, can become burdensome. And even for friendships based on pleasure, a smaller number of close companions is likely more fulfilling. As for true friendships based on virtue, he acknowledges that finding even a handful of such individuals is a rare and precious thing.
He also considers whether we need friends more in times of prosperity or adversity.
We probably tend to think we need them more in adversity, right? When we need support and help. And Aristotle agrees that friends are certainly essential during difficult times. But he also points out that in times of prosperity, we need friends to share our joy and to have the opportunity to be kind and generous towards them. It's part of what makes prosperity so enjoyable. And he also emphasizes the pain that a good person feels when a friend is suffering, showing the depth of true friendship.
So friends are important in both good times and bad times.
Absolutely. They're an essential part of a flourishing human life.
Finally, he brings us to this idea of contemplation, or theoria, as representing the